Translator's Introduction, Abridged. Logical Investigations. The Logical Investigations which is here translated is the work through which Edmund Husserl first established his reputation. It is also, in the opinion of many, including this translator, his greatest and most important philosophical work. First published in 1901, when Husserl was teaching at Halle, it was preceded by his Philosophy of Arithmetic, Volume 1 alone published, Halle, 1891, a surpassingly excellent but almost entirely forgotten work on the foundation of mathematics, and succeeded by a long series of brilliant works, some only published since Husserl's death in the series known as Husserliner, Nischoff, The Hague, which expound a systematic position known as phenomenology, and of which the best known is the Ideas Towards a Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy, first published in 1913, and translated into English by W. Boyce Gibson, Muirhead Library, Allen and Unwin. The Logical Investigations occupies a position midway between the Philosophy of Arithmetic and the later, full-blown Phenomenology, and while the word phenomenology quite often occurs in its text, it is used in a somewhat different, simpler sense than that of the later system. It means only descriptive psychology, the study of what enters into the description, the clarificatory analysis, of conscious experience and its various subspecies, rather than what may be involved in the actuality of consciousness in the world, and its causal and other relations to the body and to mundane existences generally. The text of the Logical Investigations underwent a few excisions, modifications and additions in the second edition of 1913, the Prolegomena and Investigations 1v, and 1921, Investigation v1, and they were mainly such as to bring it more into line with the later phenomenology. Fatigue and change of interest, however, prevented Husserl from carrying out the thorough revision of the text that he contemplated, and the second and third editions of the Logical Investigations are not importantly different from the first. It was only in works like Formal and Transcendental Logic, 1929, that Husserl substantially developed the treatments of logic which occur in the Logical Investigations. We may be glad that this is so. For the Logical Investigations has merits quite independent of its interesting relations to the phenomenological system, or to the subsequent development of German philosophy. It is, despite much that is dated, and much that is drearily detailed and technical, a surpassingly good piece of philosophical work, and one that has a permanent interest for Anglo-Saxon philosophers, owing to its close relations, at many points, to traditional British empiricism, and to the analytic concerns which perturbed Russell and More. But it may also claim, particularly in its last two studies, on intentional experiences and their contents and elements of a phenomenological elucidation of knowledge, to have reached an Aristotelian level of many-sided profundity, and to have sketched the basic grammar of conscious experience in a manner never before or since surpassed, or even equalled. Brentano may have led up to this remarkable consummation, and Husserl's later phenomenological writings may have developed it richly and variously, but it is here in its least controversial, best argued form, free from the extraneous trappings of a system, and its dubious methodological and covertly metaphysical pretensions, and simply one of the prime achievements of philosophy. Husserl, a Jew or of Jewish origin, died dishonored in 1938, forbidden to enter the university where he had taught, and forbidden entry, no doubt owing to political exigencies, by his own most famous pupil. It will not, however, be doubtful to anyone who carefully reads the Logical Investigations and many of the later works, that we have in him one of the small number of supreme contributors to philosophy, not unworthy of being spoken of in the same breath with Kant and Hegel, or with Plato and Aristotle. It is because I have found the writings of Husserl so superlatively valuable, and so deeply stimulating even when I rejected their detail, and because I so deeply regretted his inadequate accessibility in English, particularly when infinitely less important works were both translated and much discussed, that I undertook the present translation, which has occupied me during spells of reduced academic pressure over many years. It has proved very difficult, since I was determined that the result should be English, even if inevitably it had to be a somewhat heavy, Teutonic English, such as Husserl himself might have written, had he felt himself, authentically if extraneously, into the world of Anglo-Saxon culture. The task of teasing Husserl's richly redundant, serpentine style, with its multitude of higher-order expressions having no equivalent in our own linguistic stock in trade, into something that would flow, and have conciseness and clarity of form, even when its content was very difficult, has agitated me immensely, and I have no doubt that I have fallen short of perfect faithfulness or perfect English at many points. I do not, however, regard a translation, however good, as a substitute for the original, and believe that the attempt to make it such a substitute makes it less good as a translation than it could be. If I have made Husserl accessible to many who will make a profitable use of his ideas, instead of ranging them in a dreary chronological museum, leading up to a final showcase which enshrines pure nothingness or pure being, it scarcely matters which, I shall have achieved my purpose. Personal explanations and panegyric should not, however, extend beyond the first paragraphs of an introduction. I must try to say, in general terms, why I think Husserl's Logical Investigations such an important work. It is important not because it can now count as a valuable contribution to the logical syntax of our language, but because it uses its investigations of logic to illuminate much more fundamental topics, the nature of meaning, the ontology which meaningful discourse presupposes, and, infinitely most important, the nature of those conscious acts in virtue of which alone our words point beyond themselves to things in the world, and in virtue of which alone there is a world for us and any fellows with whom we can communicate. Husserl's polemics in favor of an adequate theory of meaning, of an objective view of logical categories and of an intentional analysis of consciousness, are directed against the contemporary idols of the theatre, the naturalisms and psychologisms of the time, which he thoroughly demolishes. They could, however, with equal point, have been directed against our own more elaborate naturalisms, which, intoxicated with newfound behavioristic categories, and employing a sophistry of models rather than a sophistry of arguments, my reference here is to certain famous language games, manage to divert attention from that central conscious subjectivity, and from its varied constitutive activities, which not only can be rendered intelligible, whether in ourselves or in others, but in ignorance of which nothing whatever can be rendered intelligible at all. As regards Husserl's view of meaning, he is the first to attempt a study of its phenomenology, of the queer manner in which words, whether spoken or written or heard or seen, and so given in intuition, yet bow themselves off the stage as prime terms of our references, and merely serve to introduce, or to help introduce, objects and connections other than themselves. And he is also the first to stress how words so used seem to clothe the objects to which they make reference possible, how they are phenomenologically inscribed upon the whole world around us, and to what an extent knowing or cognizing an object consists in putting the right name to it, seeing it as called this or that. All this has many points of affinity with recent linguistic philosophy, but it is also profoundly different. For recent linguistic philosophy is a third-person, observer's analysis, which sees meaning only in the varied use made of words and combinations of words in many natural and social situations. This observer's analysis is of course both valuable and necessary, for the phenomenology of meaning would not be complete without a study of its behavioral working out, and its detailed exhibition in the conduct of persons in their environment. A life of meaningful references that had no fulfillment in responsiveness to what environs the person, would, in fact, be not merely not actual, but intrinsically impossible. But this does not affect the fact that a personal appropriation of meaning, a lived-through understanding of what it is that words are naming or communicating, is a central feature of the meaningful use of words, and that, in default of it, there could be no more genuine semiasi than there is in the case of a computer or a tape recorder. Beings who faultlessly used the right words in the right circumstances, and who got about the world and helped other similar beings to get about it, but to whom the rationale, the sense of their proceedings was never a lived experience, totally embraced in each present and not spread out over tracts of time, nor referred hypothetically to the future. We shall not say that such a sense must always be so experienced, would not deserve to be called speakers or users of a language at all. Of them it would be right to say, words they are moved by, but they hear not, words they utter, but they speak not, neither do they understand. The phenomenology of meaning has, of course, been carried much further than we find it in Husserl, particularly by phenomenologists like Roman London, but the all-important beginnings are there. As regards Husserl's contributions to ontology, the logical investigations introduces us to a richness of categorical distinctions such as we find in Aristotle, and such as only his great contemporary Manon carried further. We have none of the misplaced economy, suitable in natural science, where it is all important to have only a few explanatory ultimates or laws, carried over into the realm of thought distinctions, where it encourages one to massacre some valuable concept, or to warp the expression of some well-understood principle, in order to satisfy the exigencies of a cheese-pairing behest not to multiply entities, and which so fears the jungle of ramifying things of reason that it is prepared to sink into. The Serbonian bob of enforced simplification. Obviously one does not lose, but gain, by noting all the iridescent variety which confronts one even at the categorical level, and which is indefeasibly part of the world as we deal with it through word and thought. There is a distinction between the thing and its parts, and between its separable parts and its inseparable sides or moments. There is the distinction between the patterns instantiated in things and the detached patterns which they exemplify. There is the distinction between things and states of affairs concerning things, and among the many varied sorts of such states of affairs, and there is the distinction between the forms of things and states of affairs and the matter, the items bound together by those forms. A philosopher sensitive enough to point to the semantic and ontological difference between the passing postman and the fact that the postman is passing, is obviously sensitive to differences which a training of the economizing, reductive sort only serves to blunt. In the logical investigations one sees the beginnings of the doctrine that all the categorical distinctions recognized by logic extend beyond the limits of language and symbolism and are implicit in our unverbalized experience. This was afterwards to be carried further in such works as Erfahrung und Urteil, where a whole world of pre-predicative negations, modalities etc., was recognized in the primitive texture of human, and even of animal experience. The heresy of pre-linguistic meanings, so much condemned by certain linguistic philosophers, is thus made the basis of an illuminating analysis. Husserl's ontology, further, is not uniformist and monolithic, as in those modern ontologies where any case of quantification commits one to a whole range of entities, which all, however, have being in precisely the same sense and manner. Like Aristotle, Husserl too has his analogy of being, where some things are there in a more foundational, primitive sense, while other entities have an essentially founded, secondary, derivative status. The developments of Husserl's ontology, and the changes induced in it by the idealistic positions of the later phenomenology, are not, however, matters that can be further discussed here. In Husserl's phenomenology, understood as a purely descriptive, internal analysis of consciousness and its varieties, we have, however, the supreme contribution of the logical investigations, as of the later, specifically so styled, phenomenological writings. What Husserl clearly saw, and what later analysts of language have failed to see, is that the interpretation of speech always proceeds in two necessarily correlated, but in many respects deeply different, and often disparate dimensions, the interpretation of speech as referring to entities and situations in the world, or to ideal abstractions from these latter, and the interpretation of speech as revealing the references that it thus embodies, the so-called acts or conscious appearances, in which such entities and situations display themselves before us, are given separately or together, as making up or at least framing our world, whether as possibilities or as limiting impossibilities. To talk of objects out there, and their actual or possible predicates and relations, may not be to talk of our conscious awareness of such matters, but it is always to imply it, and to imply it in no vague, general fashion, but in one precisely proportioned and accommodated to the objective matters of which we are talking. There is nothing mysterious, puzzling in all this, or in the regular, natural swing over from an external to an internal reference, in the passage from a situation as we think of it or perceive it, to the situation of our thought or perception of it. We are not suddenly translated from a world of limpid natural objects to the murky contents of the queer medium of the mind. We have merely passed from the obverse to the reverse side of the same coin, and any limpidity which attaches to the objects and situations referred to, attaches also to our conscious, significant references to them. People are wont to speak as if there were some close-wrapped mystery about the inner, private side of things which does not apply to their outer, public side, as if one could be wholly clear about the latter and deeply confused or in doubt about the former. This is not the case at all. To perceive that the soap in one's bathroom is exhausted, or to understand what it is for one's bathroom soap to be exhausted, is to be able to perceive or understand what one's own perception or understanding of the exhaustion of one's bathroom soap is like, and to understand, further, what anyone's understanding of the same matter must be like. We are not unclear as to what happens in a man's experience when he knows his bathroom soap to be exhausted, at least not in the respects in which that experience is directed to the domestic situation in question. There are of course other respects in which our understanding of the inner situation presents difficulties which our understanding of the outer situation does not, difficulties which we perfectly understand in the light of the fact that it is an inner situation. There are mental pictures and feelings and attenuations of mental pictures and feelings, which have to be approached, if at all, through people's hesitant, analogical accounts of what they picture and feel, and it is clear that there are difficulties, if not ones of principle, in our access to such things. There are also philosophical puzzles connected with the manner into which our experience packs or reduces to unity what can only be spelt out or unpacked in a lengthy exegesis, difficulties which have led certain philosophers to explain our packed inner state as one of readiness to say or do certain things, or of readiness to behave in certain ways, all explanations which reduce the packed concentration of conscious life to the content or process of its unpacking. All such solutions spring from a peculiar inability to see that consciousness just is, or at least is, the bringing into a focus of indivisible contemporaneity of what, from another point of view may be successive and dispersed, and that a world in which, perhaps but impossible, there were only mutually external happenings in space and time, would be a world of which we could not be conscious, in which there could be no such thing as conscious experience at all. There are, therefore, and must be, corresponding to any well-formed, articulate tract of fully significant speech, and speech is of course not always fully significant, mental stances or appearances complete and consummated in the moment, and only spread over time in the sense of lasting and changing throughout that time, in which objects and situations are set before us in various definite or indefinite lights, which change and develop as we consider those objects and situations. It is to the analysis and classification and law-governed interconnection of these mental stances or appearances that phenomenology must be directed, and through which it must illuminate the mind and language and the world. The use of a language of acts, of things done, is in this context traditional, but Husserl makes clear, like Brentano and Manon, that his use of the term has no special connection with activity. The mere presence of something to mind, its entry into consciousness in whatever unheralded manner, its mere turning up or appearance or Erscheinung, constitutes an act in the sense relevant to Husserl's analysis. What it then becomes important to note are the wide variety of alternative species into which the one invariant thing, consciousness, differentiates itself, and in fact only is the one invariant thing consciousness because it can be thus differentiated. Of these differences of manner, the most fundamental is the difference between the empty manner in which things can be there for mere thought, for meaning intention, and the fulfilled or seeing manner in which they can be there for illustrative intuition, Ansporung. Husserl is infinitely skilled in showing the vast number of differing manners and proportions in which the intuitive and emptily cogitative can be combined, and in stressing the fact that, except in the ideal limit, they are always so combined in our perception of physical objects, a physical object being always something that could be further and more richly seen and explored, however much of it is or has been present to our senses. Husserl also dwells by analogy on the intuitive grasp, the full givenness of ideal characters and states of affairs, as opposed to their imperfect presence to mind by way of symbols whose meaning or valid combination is only partially felt. And he stresses the case of fulfillment by way of internal images and by way of external physical models or diagrams or pictures, which is only a surrogate for the more complete fulfillment when what we have before us is given as the thing itself. Nowhere in the literature of philosophy are these matters more subtly treated and more full of an evident clearness and rightness. It is only a pity that they have been so infrequently and so superficially studied. Husserl's analysis of consciousness derives, of course, from Brentano's concept of intentionality, but is in several respects superior. Husserl, we may say, was the first to stress a property of intentional reference which Brentano also stated in the first appendix to the 1911 edition of his Psychology, that conscious reference is not strictly speaking a real relation, since the object or state of affairs referred to need not exist at all. The god Jupiter, Husserl says in chapter 2 of the fifth investigation, is not a real constituent, is not really present, in my conscious reference to him. To think that he need be, or could be, is to misunderstand the nature of conscious reference altogether. This point was never understood by Meinong, who had to give a certain Vorhand and height even to non-existent or absurd objects. It is not unlikely that Brentano got the first idea for his 1911 appendix from the 1901 discussion of the god Jupiter in the Logis Chantasachungen, together, of course, with much that also infuriated him. Certainly the example of the god Jupiter is cited by Krauss in his exposition of Brentano's doctrine. Husserl, however, did not fall into the prime error of making the possible non-existence of a thought object the criterion of mentality, a mistake persisted in by Chisholm. For he is clearly aware, in the second place, that references that fail of a target imply the existence of references where the target is in the nature of things hit, is itself intuited or given. The meaning of intuition is simply that of an ultimate, perfect self-givenness, and given as it in itself is. Unless there was this limiting form of intentionality, there would be no meaning in saying that certain intentions fail of their mark, that they present their objects in an inadequate or distorted light, and not as they are, or not as they wholly are. Consciousness can only give sense to its inadequacies by contrasting them with an ultimate, inherent adequacy or self-givenness. The notion of the self-evident or inwardly evident which in Brentano is no more than an internal index of our title to judge or believe something, is therefore for Husserl no more than the limiting state where doubt becomes senseless, irrelevant, since the standard of self-givenness has been reached. For Husserl therefore it is part of the notion of intentionality that there is a limiting state, ideal in the case of physical objects, in which the object as it is thought of or given simply fades out in, or achieves coincidence with, the object as it in and for itself is. The difficulties of this account of self-evidence, the many cases of seeming self-evidence which later require revision, is finally dealt with in the 1929 formal and transcendental logic which must certainly be studied if we are fully to evaluate the logical investigations. It is to be regretted that Husserl did not allow the implications of his own views on self-givenness to guide him away from the methodological etioxll or suspension of conviction which is preached in the later ideas, 31, 32 et seq. For there is arguably no clear sense to be given to a total suspension of belief in the entire world. It is only in the context of a limiting, if unattainable, complete givenness of all sides of physical realities that the notion of their doubtful, distorted, merely intended presence to consciousness can be significantly entertained, a point since made by many analytic philosophers. Husserl sees that we cannot accord a merely phenomenal, intentional status to the acts of consciousness in which physical objects are given, a point clear to Descartes as it was not clear to Kant, and he is also unwilling to accord a merely intended status to the experiences of others. He thinks, however, that he can significantly bracket the reality of all natural things, and even passes on from this to the idealistic conviction that physical things have, despite their transcendent status, for consciousness, no more than a merely intended, phenomenal being, while consciousness itself exists in an absolute manner. Ideas, 41-6. To the extent that Husserl makes this move, he transforms his brilliant, original analysis of consciousness into one of those ordinary subjectivisms which comfort the shattered ego by assuring it, quite baselessly, that in some secret manner it has manufactured its own shattering world. Of this form of subjectivism, respectable only on a theistic background like Berkeley's, there is not a trace in the logical investigations. The examination of consciousness, and of how things are given to consciousness, goes with no implication that such things have no being other than their givenness to consciousness. The contrary implication is in fact without reservation taken to be part and parcel of consciousness itself. Room is of course left for metaphysical reversals, but a proper suspension of conviction and assertion is maintained on such possibilities. It is only in the ideas, with its pretended methodological suspension of all conviction, that such a suspension is, in fact, not truly practiced. A third respect in which Husserl's treatment of consciousness is greatly superior, lies in its acknowledgement of lived-through experiences or live-through moments of experience which are not intentional at all, which present nothing to consciousness, not even themselves. Our sensations, treated as modifications of our own interior self-word, are experienced moments of this type, and they are utterly to be distinguished from the properties of physical objects which appear in corresponding perceptions. There is, Husserl thinks, as Meinong does also, a redwise mode of interior experience which corresponds to the redness we perceive, whether validly or illusorily, out there in objects. This redwiseness we feel rather than perceive, in normal experience, but in feeling we can also pass to perceiving the objective redness which is as it were its other side. This use of interior experience to mediate objective reference is misleadingly described in a language of Basile and Orpheusjungen, animating conceptions or interpretations, which suggests a traditional theory, infinitely repugnant to Husserl, of causal inferences from immediate sense data to unperceived physical objects. For Husserl the sensation, though sometimes called a datum, is not normally given at all, and its Orpheusjung or interpretation is a primary act of mind self-transcendence and not therefore, properly speaking, an interpretation or an inference at all. What it reveals is also not any remote function of physics but the redness that is authentically perceived. The theory of inner felt sides to the sensible properties of things has of course been adversely criticized by the few who have understood it properly, among whom G. E. Moore is to be reckoned. It is arguable that, though dubious on a first analysis, it becomes ever more acceptable on further examination. Husserl uses the same notion of representing contents which are not themselves presented, in his theory of categorial intuition. Through the mind's various acts of synthetic combination it can come to set before itself various forms of objective synthesis, for example the synthesis of properties in a thing, of items in a group, of identity in varying contexts etc. It is a pity that there have been so few people to understand and discuss these interesting doctrines. It is not possible, in an introduction of this length, to do more than touch on some of the many questions of interpretation raised by Husserl's logical investigations. And it is not at all possible to trace the relations of the position of that work to those of the later phenomenology. The interpretation, criticism and evaluation of Husserl's vast, immensely hard, supremely rewarding corpus of writings is barely in its beginnings. What remains for me to do, however, is to give some account as to how I have rendered some of the key terms of Husserl, an account which the use of the index will improve. I have been largely, but not absolutely uniform, in my translation of these key terms, since my aim has been to render their sense, which demands adaptation to their German or English context, rather than to provide a code from which the German can be uniformly inferred from the English. The German text is, after all, again available, even if, regrettably it was long out of print. And Husserl, despite his prolixity and technicality, conforms to the Keynesian description of a Cambridge philosopher as a prose writer, hoping to be understood. He is not a hierophant, requiring a word-for-word translation of his dark locutions in the hope that some of their doubtful sense will be preserved. I have translated Vorstellung almost uniformly by presentation, recognizing that the latter is not really an English word, the concept expressed by Husserl's, and Brentano's, term is not an English concept either. Idea is required for other purposes, and is in any case ambiguous, and representation, if anyone can tolerate it, is required for the cases where Husserl uses representation, Darstellung etc. Ansporung, Anschaulich etc. I have rendered by intuition, intuitive etc., since this is the traditional rendering of the term in translations of Kant, and since the word has no proper equivalent in English. I have occasionally varied this use by substituting or adding such terms as envisage, illustrate, picture, see, and their derivatives. Insicht etc., which more properly means intuition as understood in English, I have translated by insight etc., though sometimes I have talked of perspicuity etc. I have translated D by idea and species by species, capitalizing both terms where ideal entities are in question. I have sometimes capitalized terms, for example perception, where ideal notions were intended, but in general I have been inconsistently sparing with capitals, as I believe that they readily become tyrannous and obfuscate sense. I have translated Erlebnis, Erleben etc., by experience, though I have sometimes substituted lived experience, lived through etc. I have not devised a separate word for Erfahrung, since Husserl often uses the words interchangeably, and since the English word is used in two ways, clear in the context, and is in fact practically two words. Having an experience and learning by experience obviously involve two distinct, though cognate, uses of the word experience. I have translated psychisch by mental in informal contexts like the prolegomena where psychical would be strained, but I have used psychical where Brentano's technical use, and its contrast with physisch, was in question. I have indicated the difference between real and real, meaning in the world of natural things and actually part of respectively, by putting the German word in brackets after an English use of real. I am not convinced that Husserl meant much by his solemn distinction of these two terms, and I regret the necessity of translating worklich by actual, when real is often more suitable. It is curious that Husserl should have used the word real of a thing like status which need not involve reality in the sense of genuine existence, and which he came afterwards to hold never involved reality in the English sense. I have translated schlitt by straightforward, and eigentlich, in technical contexts, by authentic, and I have translated unselfständig by non-independent, since the English word dependent has less negativity and more relativity than unselfständig. Sometimes I have also had traffic with self-sufficient for selbstständig, instead of independent. In Holt I have, of course, translated by content, but this makes difficulties in the case of other words for which content alone seems suitable. Geholt, for example, has been badly translated by substance. Fundieren, fundiert etc. are of course founded, though sometimes I have yielded to the charms of basing, based etc., but fundierend has varied from foundational to underlying according to context or euphony. Moment I have usually translated as moment, but sometimes, in less technical contexts, as site or aspect. Be due to in the sense of significant content I have translated by meaning, less commonly by sense. Husserl does not follow fruit in keeping the two words distinct, and neither ever means the object of a reference. The word be due ten I have translated by act of meaning or simply by the verb to mean, though I have sometimes used reference as an equivalent. Husserl in the main tends to say that we mean objects, not meanings, by way of the meanings which words have rather than mean, and I have followed his usage in English, with which it on the whole agrees, rather than trying to introduce distinctions into my translation which have only recently been thought necessary. Wahrnehmung etc. I have translated by perceive, perception, the established equivalence, though when a Wahrnehmung means an individual act, I have, for the sake of shortness, translated it by percept. Innere Wahrnehmung has been translated by inward or internal perception quite without principle, and the same holds mutatis mutandis of Wahrnehmung. Erkenntnis I have generally translated by knowledge, though there are contexts, particularly in the sixth investigation where cognition, recognition seemed more suitable. Evidence and its derivatives I have rendered by self-evidence, inward evidence according to context. There are cases of evidence, for example those of innere Wahrnehmung, which have no self-evidence in the English sense. The adjective evident I have sometimes translated by evident, but in general I have found that the forensic and documentary associations of the English word evidence are fatal to understanding. Many students are permanently bewildered by these associations. That a similar thing holds of reflection, reflective etc., used to translate the German word where it has to do with introspection, and not with reflection as we ordinarily understand it, has not led me to depart from the use in question. After all, Locke's similar use of reflection has misled, and always will mislead, countless incautious and forgetful students. I have translated begründung etc., by grounding etc., also by proof, demonstrate, demonstration, validate, validation. It expresses a reversed view of argument more usual to continental than to British intellectuals. With these explanations, it is to be hoped that Husserl can speak for himself. J. N. Findlay, Yale University.